0217 hours. North Arabian Sea, 350 nautical miles southeast of Bandar Abbas. The radar contact appeared for exactly 4 seconds. Then it vanished. On the Combat Direction Center of the aircraft carrier, the sudden silence was worse than an alarm. The surface search console showed nothing abnormal now, just dark water and commercial traffic lanes. But the operator didn't look away. He froze, fingers hovering above the trackball, replaying the moment in his head. 4 seconds was too long for interference, too short for confirmation. The ship was already inside the outer bands of the storm. Flight operations were suspended. That was the assumption. That was the plan. But assumptions had a way of collapsing once the deck started to move. On the flight deck above, 12 aircraft sat fully fueled, folded wingtips locked, lashed to the steel with chains rated for calm seas. Each one represented more than $100 million. Each one was now subject to forces no checklist could completely tame. The officer of the deck turned to the tactical action officer. "Run it again." The operator complied. The replay showed the same thing. A contact. 4 seconds. Gone. No classification. No bearing change. No second appearance. It could have been sea clutter. It could have been a fishing dhow running dark. It could have been nothing. Or it could have been something the storm was hiding. The ship rolled 3 degrees to starboard. On the flight deck, a tie-down chain went slack for half a second, then snapped tight again. Metal groaned. No one heard it over the wind. At 0221, the ship rolled 12 degrees. Not catastrophic, not headline-worthy, but enough to shift weight faster than human reflexes could compensate. The chains held. One of the deck crew working a tie-down forward of the island felt the lurch through his knees. He grabbed the safety line and waited for the ship to settle. It didn't settle the way it should have. The roll came back slower, heavier, like the ship was hunting for balance and couldn't find it. Below decks, no one said anything. Not yet, because once the order was given, it couldn't be taken back. The storm was never the first problem. The jets were already in jeopardy, not from wind or waves, but from the one thing no one had accounted for: time under stress. Every roll transferred mass. Every transfer loaded the chains. Every cycle brought metal closer to a failure point that wouldn't announce itself until it was too late. Metal doesn't fail from force alone. It fails from repetition. Subscribe. These moments don't come with warnings? Would you have acted yet? Or waited for confirmation? By doctrine, aircraft carriers do not avoid storms. They anticipate them, study them, maneuver through them. Storm season was not an anomaly. It was a known variable, baked into deployment schedules and training pipelines. Crews drilled for heavy weather the same way they drilled for flight ops and damage control. But this storm was behaving incorrectly. Satellite models predicted dissipation. The onboard meteorology detachment expected manageable seas. The carrier altered course to ride the system's weaker edge, keeping wind across the bow and stress within limits. For the first 2 hours, the plan held. Then the barometric pressure dropped faster than expected. The deck officer noticed it first, not because of a warning, but because the pitch felt wrong. Too fast, too uneven. The ship wasn't settling into a rhythm. It was hunting. At 0249, a petty officer on the flight deck reported a slackened tie-down on an F/A-18 parked forward of the island. Procedure dictated replacement within minutes. 2 sailors moved to correct it. They worked quickly. Wind tore at their float coats. The deck was slick with spray. They didn't talk. There was no point. The roar made everything else irrelevant. The replacement chain went on clean. Torqued, tested, logged. Perfect execution. But perfect execution only mattered if the assumptions underneath it were correct. And they weren't. The chains were rated for calm seas, for static load, for predictable motion envelopes. This storm was exceeding the envelope incrementally, slowly enough that no single roll violated procedure, but fast enough that the cumulative stress was building in ways the system couldn't measure. At 0313, a senior chief on the hangar deck noticed something subtle. The spacing between two aircraft had narrowed, not by much, less than an inch, not enough to trigger alarms, not enough to violate safety margins, just enough to matter. He didn't call it in immediately. There was no guidance for almost. The ship rolled again. Above decks, the wind increased another 5 knots. The bridge logged it without comment. The carrier had weathered worse. What the bridge did not log was fatigue. This was the 7th hour of storm posture. Crew rotations were stretched. Voices were shorter. The calm discipline of training was being replaced by something quieter and more dangerous. Urgency without panic. At 0331, the air boss made the first call that would later be debated. He ordered all aircraft elevators locked in place. It was a defensive move. It was also irreversible. On the flight deck, the tie-down that had just been replaced went slack again. This time, the ship rolled harder. 14 degrees. The sailor closest to it didn't move to fix it. He just held on. Was this discipline or misplaced confidence? The hangar bay was designed as controlled space, protected, sheltered, predictable. That belief had ended wars before it ended this night. The most dangerous place on the ship wasn't the flight deck. It was the hangar bay, where no one was expecting anything to go wrong. As the ship rolled, the aircraft inside responded differently than the ones above. Their wheels weren't chained to exposed steel in open air. They were braked, chocked, and spaced according to doctrine that assumed certain motion envelopes. Those envelopes were being exceeded, but the hangar bay had no wave spray, no wind, no visible chaos, so no one was watching it the way they were watching the deck. At 0313, the senior chief watched the spacing narrow again. A tow bar shifted. A chock slid. Just barely. In isolation, none of it was dangerous. In sequence, it was creating a cascade no one had modeled. Weight was transferring unevenly. Brakes were holding, but holding against forces they weren't designed for. The aircraft weren't moving, yet, but the potential energy was building. Physics doesn't care about doctrine. At 0342, a hydraulic technician noticed fluid pooling near the starboard berthing hatch. It wasn't much, a slow seep. Probably condensation. He marked it for follow-up and moved on. Above decks, the storm worsened. The ship rolled 16 degrees. In the hangar bay, an EA-18G Growler rocked on its landing gear. The main mount absorbed the motion. The brakes held, but the nose gear twisted, not enough to fail, not enough to notice, just enough to stress a connection that had already been cycled too many times. At 0356, the senior chief made the call. Spacing reduction, progressive. The response was immediate and wrong. The order came down to add restraints, more chains, more tension, more load. The logic was sound. Prevent movement by locking everything down harder. The execution was not. As chains tightened, they removed the aircraft's ability to move with the ship. Flexibility was eliminated. Now every roll transferred force directly into landing gear assemblies, never meant to absorb lateral shock. The hydraulic line on the Growler ruptured. No fire, no explosion, just fluid on steel and the knowledge that something fundamental had shifted. If you're still watching, this story mattered. Where would you have focused, deck or hangar? Aircraft elevators are designed to move jets between deck and hangar quickly, safely, and predictably. In storms, they become liabilities, massive moving platforms that can amplify motion. Locking them was standard practice. What wasn't standard was the timing. With the elevators locked, aircraft trapped between configurations could not be repositioned. The ship now had two choices. Ride out the storm with the deck as configured. Break doctrine and reconfigure under worsening conditions. Neither option was clean. At 0356, a sensor flagged abnormal vibration near Elevator 2. Engineering ran diagnostics. Nothing crossed a red line, but red lines were never the problem. They came after. At 0404, the hydraulic rupture was confirmed. The hangar bay chief reported it to the air boss. The air boss reported it to the bridge. The bridge consulted the engineer. The engineer consulted the load tables. The load tables had no entry for this configuration. At 0412, the carrier lost steering response for 7 seconds. 7 seconds doesn't sound like much. In heavy seas, steering loss means the ship is no longer cutting through waves. It's being pushed by them. For 7 seconds, 100,000 tons of steel and aircraft became a passenger. The captain was called to the bridge. He was briefed in fragments: weather divergence, hangar instability, elevator lock status, fuel risk, steering anomaly. There was no checklist for this configuration. Doctrine assumed storms and aircraft, not storms, plus transitional states, plus equipment failure plus crew fatigue. Every instinct said wait. Every model said hold course. But models didn't account for this. He had one option left that technically violated guidance. He ordered the ship to turn into the storm. It increased stress. It increased risk. It also stabilized motion. The order moved weight where physics wanted it, not where procedure preferred it. The helmsman hesitated for half a second, then complied. The ship began its turn. Below decks, aircraft settled. The chains went slack, then tight. Once, not twice. No more progressive movement. The spacing stopped narrowing. The hydraulic leak slowed. The elevator vibration damped. By 0501, the worst of the storm had passed. If this ever happens again, you'll want to recognize it. Subscribe. Was this restraint or calculated risk? No jets were lost. Officially. 3 aircraft required depot-level inspection. One EA-18G Growler was quietly written down, its airframe hours adjusted, its service life shortened by stress no maintenance log would ever fully capture. Multiple procedures were revised without explanation. Tie-down protocols were updated. Hangar bay motion monitoring was added. Elevator lock timing was formalized. No one was disciplined. No medals were awarded. The incident never received a name. No congressional inquiry. No news coverage. No documentary crew. Just a notation in a maintenance database and a conversation that happened once, briefly, in the captain's stateroom. The air boss asked the question no one else would. If we'd waited another 10 minutes. The captain didn't let him finish. We didn't. That was the only answer that mattered. Storm season continued, and the carrier sailed on, its flight deck intact, its air wing complete, at least on paper. What saved the jets wasn't strength. It wasn't technology. It wasn't even training. It was a single decision made without certainty, in a moment where doing nothing felt safer than doing the wrong thing. Most people never notice when aircraft carriers survive storms. They only notice when they don't. Should doctrine bend in moments like this, or hold firm?